All right, ladies and gents, welcome to the Champions Way podcast. Host here, Samuel Van Kuren here. I'm with the great Ryan Marone. So we are going to we're going to dive in here. We're going to go over the 5 things most people don't know about men's mental health. But real quick, Ryan. So Ryan's a licensed mental health counselor. So if anybody can speak to this stuff, it's going to be him. So I'm gonna let him take the floor, let him introduce himself a little bit, and then we're going to get rocking and rolling. This is going to be some. I'm real excited about this. We're going to cover some good stuff here.
Thank you, Sam. So licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida, LPC in the state of New Jersey, which is, that's the license to practice in those states. They just got different letters. So originally from New Jersey, got my bachelor's degree at Monmouth University, right in Monmouth County. I got my master's degree at Barry University in Miami Shores. I've been practicing therapist for a little over 6 years, 7 if you count internships, because that is practicing just as much as any other job I've had before in this field. I've worked in treatment centers. I've worked in jails before. I've worked with, kids under 18. I did groups in eating disorder facilities. So luckily, I've been fortunate enough to have a pretty wide range of clientele that I've worked with before. But nothing more interesting, to me at least, than the men's mental health part of it. So I'm really looking forward to it, Sam.
Yeah, this is going to be exciting, and I think you know any woman whose boyfriend, their boyfriend's or husband, and anybody they're talking to, just men in their lives, I think this is going to be super powerful, and obviously for every guy. And I know when we talk about men's mental health, it's a stigma, and it's a lot of guys don't want to talk about it. I think we're in a cool part. I think in this time in mental health history where I think men's mental health is becoming a less taboo and becoming more aware. And I think people around are going to have to adapt to what how things are. Um, but anyways, let's cut right to the chase. We'll be right to the point. So we got 5 things most people don't know about men's mental health, and we'll kick things off with number one. Go for it, Ryan.
Okay, I got it all written down, ready to go, Sam. So number one,
Let's go.
not that like any of these are more important than others, but this one I think is the one that's like the most foundational piece of the whole thing is that somewhere along the line, like in a societal sense or whatever that may be, and I think you're absolutely right about the fact that like I'm grateful to be a practicing therapist in this generation where the stigma hopefully is starting to move in a direction that isn't as heavy as it's always been. But this one main thing, this one main idea that silence is strength is quite
Mm,
possibly one of the biggest myths, you know, around the whole mental health field in general when it comes to men. Now, obviously, like as we talk about these things, these are things that women could also experience as well. Um, but what we'll talk about today is what more typically happens with the male population and males that I've worked with before. And so many times I've worked with so many different clients where their biggest barrier to getting themselves help is this idea that if they get help, they've now kind of announced to the world that they're weak. And
yeah.
through history and through the way that we looked at these things, this idea of like stoicism and we use the term like this person's a rock and things like that. We've decided along the line that that is a strength, a showing of strength. Um, when in reality, and like one of my favorite examples of this is when I used to do a men's mental health group every Friday um, in the treatment center that I worked at for many years. And when we talk about this exact topic, and every night they would go to meetings, right? Because they would go to either AA meetings or NA meetings. And I would ask them, I said, okay, so if silence is weakness, right? When somebody goes up and speaks at a meeting or they chair a meeting and they talk to you about intense things and difficult things, what do you think of them, right? And almost everybody in this group will say, you know, there's courage in that, there's bravery in that, there's power in that. So then the next natural question is then how come
Mhm.
we think if you go do it, then it's weakness? When did we decide that if I go speak, it's weakness, but if somebody else does it, it represents courage and strength, right? Because the truth of it is, we can impact the most people, we can provide for the most people, we can support the most people by being heard, especially when it comes to topics like this. So, this idea
Yeah.
that silence and just carrying the weight is the strength option, the truth of it is, it's harder, it's more difficult, and it displays so much strength to talk about your emotions, to, you know, face some of the most difficult things. And it's tried and true that in all of those groups that I did so many years, that the overall kind of like light bulb moment of like, why have I decided this was weak my whole life? But when somebody else does it, male or female, I decided it's strength. So it's very much this spotlight effect of like, if I go do it, it's weakness. And
Yeah.
that's such a major, major barrier. And it keeps so many people from help.
Do you think it's because I think, I think back even when I was raised, right? And it's, boys don't cry and a lot of these things. And, as when we get
Sure.
taught to compartmentalize and really, just suppress our emotions. I think, do you think part of it could be almost a fear of how it might feel to open up?
I think fear is a major part of it, right? Because the truth of it is, a lot of times, one of our biggest coping mechanisms, and again, more prevalent in males, but females absolutely can be in this
Mhm.
category, is, if we don't face it, then we don't have to deal with it, right? So it's like the old adage of like, if you don't go to the doctor, nothing's wrong with you type of idea, right? It is the idea that once I am vulnerable now, once I face it, I can no longer pretend it's not there. And that could be a very scary thing. The beauty of therapy and going to work these things out is therapists don't really allow for that, right? Sooner or later, we will go there, we will face it, and you'll find out that although the journey is difficult, the delayed gratification is exponentially more healthy and more powerful, right? So I do believe that kind of fear, and sometimes even just the fear of the unknown of like, it's almost like the idea of like, you ever you ever have a bunch of like receipts in your car and you pop the window down, you forget they're there, and they all fly out, and like
Yeah.
you just never have those back. I think a lot
Yeah.
of times that's a big fear when it comes to things like this. If it's like once those receipts are out the window, I can't have them back. They're out in the world now, and what is
Yeah.
that going to look like for me? And I think that's a big part of it is the unknown.
Yeah. It is that's spot on. I think that's a crucial point overall, right? It's silence is weakness. And I think the other part of it too, I think back to a lot of the guys that I coach were actually I made a point with one of the guys where it's a lot of people will define strength as silence essentially. I said on a different term, I can't remember, but that's the kind of general topic. But then you end up struggling. And not only are you struggling for yourself, you're causing the other people around you to struggle. It's going to be affecting your kids. So then what's the real symbolism of strength? Is it sucking that in, having everybody else suffer around you? Or is it actually diving in for yourself and doing the work necessary so the other people around you can flourish?
It's crucial, Sam. It
Yeah.
really is crucial because if we can change our relationship with that word, particularly for men, so many more doors will open, right?
Yeah.
If there's so many different layers to so many different things in therapy, but that one foundational piece for men, if we can change our relationship from, you know, strength is truly in the spoken rather than the silence, so many doors open. So many doors open. I've seen it throughout my whole career. It's tried and true. And that's why I used to love those men's mental health calls on Fridays because it's a group, right? So by default, speaking will happen. Somebody will talk, right? We're not just there to stare at each other. So once that does happen, there's no longer, right, silence as a weapon in there anymore. There's no
Yeah.
longer silence is the healthy path. There's actually now vulnerability being the healthy path. And so many doors open up for people that may not even known the doors were there. And it's
Yeah.
truly one of the most beautiful things that you can be a part of when it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we could keep talking on this topic as we keep going, but we'll get to number two. So I'll let you segue into that.
Deal. So number two, all emotions are valid. Okay. Again, this is a tried and true
Mm.
trope for therapy in general, right? But it's so clear to me with so many of my male clients. The term so much comes up like, I shouldn't feel this way, right? Which truly, truly doesn't make any sense. Nobody in the history of mankind has ever been able to find their control system, find kind of like their fuse box and turn different emotions on and off as they see fit, right? We don't have a choice. What you experience emotionally, the emotions that show up for you are not up to you. What you do with them, how you navigate them, how you express them is absolutely up to you, right? But to judge yourself for a feeling that you can't control is inherently a very painful thing. And I think for males specifically, again, especially if it's an emotion that we decided is weak, right?
Mhm.
Like embarrassment or sadness or shame, then they shouldn't be feeling it as if they've, for some reason, even though they're a living, breathing human being, they have misstepped because they feel a particular emotion. So I think that part is so vastly important, is that, and there's an important differentiation, because every emotion that any human's ever experienced, in my opinion, as a therapist, is valid, right? But it being valid and being factual are two different things. So that is
Mm,
something we work out in therapy. Like, you can feel alone, it doesn't mean you
yeah.
are alone. It is a
Right.
valid emotion. It is one that you are experiencing that we can talk about and process. But it also doesn't mean you have to just take every emotion now and treat it as fact, right? Because I think that's a fear that people have a lot, especially men, of like, okay, now if I admit this feeling, I now have to live in that world. That's not true, right?
Mm,
You can admit that you're experiencing that emotion, but every emotion we've ever had in our lives is a visitor, right? It's just something that's
hmm.
visiting in your life. It's not who you are, it's what you're experiencing in that moment. So we can challenge it, we can experience it, we can process it, and we can navigate it as best we can, right? But it's just visiting. So we don't have to pretend it's not there, and we don't have to try to operate in this place like I shouldn't be feeling as if you chose it. It really, it creates such a shame around something you can't control, which can be very, very detrimental.
Yeah, yeah. I think you brought up a real important topic, which is, emotions aren't always fact, and a lot of times, a lot of the guys that I work with it's breaking these down. You have X emotion. What makes you feel like that? And a lot of times it comes back to, past experiences in life. It comes down to perceptions and the values and the beliefs that we carry about ourselves and the people around us that then produce this emotion. And then it's when you break it down like that, it almost you could start to see the fallacy of it. Whereas this emotion is based off of so many things of your personal life experience. What makes that fact? It doesn't make it not real, like you said, right?
Good.
It's just
Yeah.
let's break this down. Why are we feeling this way? And then provide context to it. And sometimes that can actually help alleviate that emotion. You can create new emotions from that, right?
Yes. And you can have a different relationship with it, right? You can't choose a feeling, but you can choose, again, like how you navigate it. So imagine now, if we have men out there who are struggling, men who, you know, maybe are starting to feel like getting help is a good idea, could be productive, but we've decided that sadness is not an emotion that we can express and we shouldn't be feeling. Imagine now if that male or these men can change their relationship with that emotion, understand this is valid, this is legit, I'm experiencing it because I'm a living human being, but it doesn't have to be my reality, right? Sadness is not a destination, just a visitor, right? So imagine
Hmm.
now if we can change our relationship to that and go get some help and now actually process and work through it rather than it dictate our lives,
Yeah.
right? It kind of goes back to number one now. Speaking that now into existence actually takes away the strength of that emotion and puts
Yeah.
the
I
strength
think
back in you.
it's almost kind of like, because it goes back to like when I was saying at the beginning, where I think we're at this interesting time in mental health history for men, where it's I almost feel like there's the redefinition of what masculinity is.
Hmm.
Because like you said, people have this perception of masculinity as silence, stoic, no emotion, but then you just struggle and suffer internally, and then other people around you, you end up having these moments that are just not beneficial for you or the other people around you. But it's how to take these emotions, process them, and then still maintain that sense of masculinity within yourself. And it's just redefining that, what strength really is. And then on top of that, I think you have the other layer of it, which is society, because I think society still hasn't caught up with this too, right? They encourage mental health, right? But they don't. When it's there, they almost don't know how to handle themselves, right?
Yes. Yes. And that's, you bring up such a beautiful point. And my hope for anybody that may listen to this or anybody that's seeking therapy, like, nobody gets to tell you how to express masculinity, right? Nobody gets to listen. If masculinity is stoicism and not saying anything about emotions and not that, then I'm in a lot of trouble. It's my whole life, my whole job is vulnerability and speaking to people and talking about emotions and experiencing those things, so we get to define how we express that, right? And what that actually means to us, right? So exactly like you said, if silence and sitting with that and allowing that pain to manifest in other places is hurting you, hurting the people around you, what trade are we making? We're going to do all that. We're going to create all that pain for you and the people around me simply so you can protect what you believe to be masculinity. That's the trade we want to make. That's how we want to live. I'd imagine if I put it in those exact terms, those people wouldn't make that trade,
Yeah.
right? But we've been so warped that we do that day to day. And I say we because I'm sure there's days where I still get caught in that stuff, and definitely before this profession was a big part of my life, and I was just, walking around with the same general idea of this stuff.
Yeah.
Of
I'm
course.
guilty myself, at one point.
Yes, of course.
And I think it's the other piece too is if you think of like strong leaders, you reference the example of somebody getting up speaking and talking about themselves and how you
Mhm.
define that as courage and everything. I would almost akin that to leadership. And a lot of times you can align, and maybe
Definitely.
this is kind of a good tie between to create that masculinity bridge. Leadership and masculinity typically go hand in hand, at least our perceptions of masculinity classically. And in order to be a good leader, you have to have clarity. But in order to have clarity, you have to be able to have tools and techniques and work through these emotions and these feelings that you're having. And in the process of actually stuffing all of this down, you're preventing yourself from having that clarity to be the ultimate person that you can be, to be that leader, to be that version of you that you ultimately feel is best.
Yeah. And we're missing pieces then, right? Because without that, it's very, very hard to have empathy in a productive, not productive, but like in a like an elevated way if you're not in tune with your own emotions. Because how
Yeah.
empathy basically is just you being able to find whatever somebody's experiencing across from you, you being able to find that emotion yourself and putting yourself there with them. So if you've never really processed your own emotions in that way, you never really worked that out, it's going to be really hard to do for other people, right? Maybe empathy isn't absolutely necessary to be a good leader, but I'd imagine it absolutely helps, right? And I
Yeah. Part of it.
know for me personally, if I had somebody leading me, it'd be important that empathy was part of their makeup, right?
Yeah.
So at least I'm not just a number, right? I'm a
Yeah.
human, living, breathing person. And I think that's a big part of what you're saying there is that I'd imagine as far as leadership goes, empathy, emotional intelligence could be invaluable weapons. Of course.
Yeah. And I think even in today's world, emotional intelligence, I think that will be the move the next 10 years with the advent of AI and all this stuff. As much as you can cover things up with the technology, if you still don't have the emotional capacity to be able to make the right judgments and have the empathy, because I think back to the best leader I had, somebody I worked with, he had empathy to what people were going through. It didn't stop him from making the hard decisions and making the right, or making the hard decisions and the difficult moves that he needed to do, but he had empathy. And if you look at all of the classical big leaders, they all have this ability to have empathy, to have perspective. I think it's a lot of what business coaches teach too from a leadership perspective. So, but anyways, we could keep talking on this probably for another hour in itself. So we'll
That's
segue
the
into
beauty of it.
number three. Go for it.
Number three, the anger funnel. I love this one because
Uh,
it's so tried and true. And it's one of these unique things where like so many emotions that a male experiences, we've decided society is taboo. We don't talk about, right? Like we had talked about before, sadness, embarrassment, stuff like that,
yeah,
right? These are not those things I want to speak about openly. But for whatever reason, to some degree, anger is accepted and sometimes even glorified, right? Of like, this is a guy
mhm,
that gets stuff done. This is a scary dude, right? And to some degree, it can be glorified. This is an emotion, my friends, right? So like this
mhm,
idea that like we can't show emotions like that, but that one in particular is okay. That one in particular, you know, is typical and allowed is a very misguided thing. Because the truth of it is, all anger really is, and this is one of my favorite things because when I was in grad school training to be a therapist, right, we had a whole class on this. And what we learned is that anger is a secondary emotion, right? So what that means is that anger is always felt after you felt something first, right? And
mhm.
Sam, I argued this up and down because I'm like, I don't know, I'm like a 24-year-old kid. I think I know everything. And I was like, listen, I'm from the Northeast. I'm from Jersey. I have a lot of people in my life that go 0 to 100. They feel nothing first. They absolutely just, it's like, it's ingrained in their being, right? This is what I believe. And thank God for my very intelligent and empathetic professors and therapists in there that help me understand this, that it is a reaction to the other emotion. It's an emotion that that you're not working out, that you don't want to process. And anger is actually your way of communicating it, right?
Mhm.
So for men, one of the most interesting ones is either disrespect, feeling disrespected, or embarrassment,
Yep.
right? So many times that gets met with anger when all we're really trying to communicate is that I'm embarrassed or I feel disrespected. Because what do we think when we get angry and we yell and it's like we can control the room again, right? So if I feel
Mhm.
disrespected, it's this idea that I'm down here and they think I'm up there. So how am I going to get it back to here or maybe me up, right? I'm going to, throw my weight around. I'm going to be
Yeah.
loud. I'm going to make, I'm going to try to control this room again. All that really is that feeling of disrespect, maybe some feelings of insecurity in yourself, and they all go into a funnel and they spin around, they spin around, and they come out as anger
Yeah,
because
that's
we didn't want to
powerful.
deal with the first stuff, right? Same thing, embarrassment's a big one. Sadness is a big one for a lot of people because I feel sad. I feel disconnected to the world. I'm not allowed to talk about that, or I feel like I can't. So once
Mm.
that's triggered, we go in the funnel, we spin around, and anger comes out. What we actually learn a lot of the times is that clients that come for anger management, many times, not always, because nothing in therapy is guaranteed, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but many
Yeah.
times we boil it down and we get down to what they're really experiencing, and depression is actually a really big part of that because it's so
Mhm.
many different things that they're experiencing that they don't know how to talk about or deal with. And in the funnel goes, and how can I express to somebody that I'm hurting, that I'm in pain, but I don't know how to say it? Loud, angry. It is a funnel. It is a funnel and it
It's
is a secondary emotion.
it's so interesting because I think one of the things too. Being a father, I'm exposed to a lot of these things where I think as much as people always hate on the millennials, I think it's our generation that's going to raise the most intelligent, emotionally intelligent children
I think so too.
because I see these.
I think we can
What's
carry
that?
that banner.
What's that?
I think so too. I think we can carry that banner.
Yeah, and I think I see all these things popping around where it's these essentially things of how to help your kids process their emotions. And I think back when I was a kid, that just wasn't even a thing. But then you just listening, hearing you talk a lot about this stuff, I think of like my toddler, where it's she has all these things going on. How does she express them? Anger, right? Just
Yeah.
throws a fit. And then
Yes.
and you hear all the time, right? Adults are sometimes just adult children, and I
Yes.
think that's more from a sarcastic standpoint. But I think this is more from a mental, emotional standpoint, where I think again it goes back to men where we're just not taught how to process these emotions, and we just rely on such a elementary basic response to things that as you get
Yes.
older and you have more responsibilities and you become a stronger individual, it becomes more and more dangerous,
Yeah.
you know?
If we don't develop awareness and healthier solutions, we will go back to old ones. It's tried and true, right? So it's exactly like you said. Like, what do we learn when we're kids? That's going to get the reaction from people is tantrum, stomp your feet, throw things, stuff like that. And maybe as adults, we don't display it to that degree as far as like childish behavior, but it's the
Right.
same type of mechanism of something's going on with me. I don't know how to communicate it. So how am I going to get the attention of people and communicate my pain, right?
Yeah.
It's an adult version of a tantrum. It's an adult version of stomping your feet. It's an adult version of throwing toys across the room, right?
Yeah.
Because if we never took the time, and listen, as far as taking the time, sometimes people are never really given the opportunity to take the time to do this, right? So this
That
is
is
not a
true.
judgment fault thing. This is a, hey, if you're hearing this and this is something you're struggling with, maybe go take a look because you may find a much healthier solution in the sense of like, this is what I'm actually experiencing. I'm actually embarrassed, right? And imagine now if I can actually talk about that, process that, realize that's human and normal, and then next time I feel embarrassed, I can understand that that's what I'm experiencing, and now I don't have to yell and scream because I know what I'm actually up against here now. I know what I actually need to communicate. Imagine
Mhm.
now if that was an answer. Everything can change for you. So it can be a very, very powerful thing once it clicks.
Yeah. And I think the hardest step for a lot of people is in in taking that initial acknowledgement. A lot of these emotions we're talking about is, you talked about the receipts going out the window, and I think part of that is accountability, right? In order to move forward on something like this, and a lot of this is accepting responsibility for all of this stuff. And I think I always, everybody that I always coach, I start from the place of everybody comes from the right intention.
Yeah.
Everybody's, I think, is truly a good person.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of learned behaviors or or techniques and mechanisms, coping mechanisms that have not become productive to themselves and the people around them that get them into this spot. I was talking to a gentleman the other day who was 69 years old, and he was telling me a story, and he's gone through a life of just pain, just sheer pain. And he was telling me that, like, I was the first person that he had opened up to about this stuff in years. And this is just a random call. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So I think it's to be able to acknowledge a lot of that, because that accountability means you have to accept responsibility for the pain you induced on somebody, even though you're trying to come from the right place. You just don't know how to process it. But if we have anger as the superficial emotion that comes out first, it makes it you're just going to cause more and more issues, and you have to dive into that stuff, you know.
Yeah,
But
and
anyways,
you're beating yourself up from the inside out, and that's what the
yeah,
hardest thing too is. Like, it's a solution because it's the one that you have. It doesn't make it a good one,
yeah,
right? Just because it's a solution doesn't make it a healthy one. It might solve your problem in that moment of like, I don't really have to talk about my other stuff and I can express stuff, but as far as sustainability goes, it's going to be pretty empty.
yeah. I think we need to do another podcast and go deeper on these things, but we can segue into number 4 here.
All right, number 4. This one's I mean, it's all subjective as far as heaviness goes, but this is one that I think surprises people sometimes. As far as suicide rates go, men are significantly more likely to commit the act of suicide. And I think,
Mm,
when we talk about silence being strength and we talk about all these like different, you know, if there is no solution that we found that is healthy, many times we will find an unhealthy one. And unfortunately, that's, the most extreme of unhealthy solutions. If men feel as if they've backed themselves into a corner, or the world has backed themselves in a corner where there's nowhere to go with these things, many times that could possibly lead to some of the most extreme of solutions, like something like that. So, again, this idea that like men don't feel anything and this is not, mental health, it's a taboo thing for men. I think sometimes, like with therapy and stuff like that, there's a certain level of difficulty for people to buy in, especially men, because it's not a hard science in a lot of areas, right? Like,
yeah,
you go to a medical doctor, you go to a psychiatrist, it's hard science, right? Therapy is backed by research, so there absolutely is that, but it's not like an A to B, like,
hmm,
okay, we diagnosed you with this illness, we've seen this before, take this cream on your arm, you're gonna be okay, right?
yeah,
We're backed in science, we're backed in theory, right? But it's not a hard science like that. So sometimes people have a hard time buying in of it's like, oh, we're just gonna talk and we're just gonna lay down and they're gonna write and ask me how I feel. Like, no, we're not. We're gonna do like real work and we're gonna go after things, right? And if you need hard science, and that's the thing that's, I don't know what's a harder statistic than that. Those are real numbers, real statistics about the most extreme of, you know, sad solutions. So
yeah.
I think that's one of the things that people don't realize as much either is we can keep saying that we're blue in the face that, women are the emotional ones and they're the ones that need it. But the world's going to keep showing us that that's not the case. And history will continue to repeat itself.
Yeah, it's I read something the other day where it was they did a study on I forgot how they were measuring emotions, but essentially came to the same conclusion that both men and women are equally emotional and equally emotionally intelligent. Um, and I've heard this before, where men are far more likely to actually commit the act than women, and I think this comes back to the aggression standpoint. Correct me if I'm wrong. Um,
It's a big part of it.
yeah, and it's powerful, and I was just at a concert last month, and Papa Roach was playing. They actually they did a song on oh man, what's it
Is it
called?
the old one, Last Resort?
No,
Okay. I got a little bit of pop roach
they
knowledge.
closed out with that.
Yeah.
But it was a new one off their new album. It was they're dedicating it to Chester Bennington, who from Linkin Park, and it's I think it's "Leave the Light On" is the name of the song, and um, I mean, Emotion was talking about it. I don't think there was a dry eye in the building listening to that song because
Mhm.
it's such a powerful topic for some of the stuff, and I've been fortunate that nobody in my circle has done this, but I know people that know people who did, and it causes more pain outwardly than I think it's intended.
Yeah, and it's, I'm glad we can talk about it today because I know it's not a topic that is easily walked into and talked about
Yeah.
because it's heavy. It's heavy. And interestingly, Linkin Park is actually my favorite band of all time. So when Chester Bennington, ended up committing that act, and I remember feeling like I lost a friend. It was like to that level,
Yeah.
um, and just I know it's not super important here, but for anybody that is listening to this and is struggling with that idea of expressing these emotions stuff like that, and we need an outlet, Linkin Park's a great band to go do that with. Like he was very
Very
open and
much
honest
so.
about a lot of the things. So I realize that's a little bit of a strange aside, but if that's sometimes music is able to express things that we have a hard time expressing ourselves. So Bob Roach does a pretty nice job of that too,
Yeah.
interestingly.
Yeah.
But yeah, Linkin Park, we'll do that.
Yeah.
We'll do that for you too. Interestingly,
I think we should do it. We'll need a podcast on each one of these topics. But I know we're running out on time, so we'll get to number 5 here.
let's do it. So last one, um, going to therapy / getting a diagnosis does not equal crazy. This is one of these
Mm.
things that I hear so many times, and it's interesting. It's like, so before I see clients, before I you know take on the therapeutic relationship and things like that, I do a 15-minute phone consultation, right? Just to talk to the potential client, see what they're looking for, see where they want to go, what direction, right? And so many times there's some iteration of trying to convince me. They go, "This is what I'm experiencing, but I'm not crazy." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know, I know, right?" Just simply because you want to get help and because you are a living, breathing human being who has noticed that life can be hard and emotional processing can be hard does not now make you crazy, right? And I find it so interesting that that's such an ingrained thing now of like, if you go to therapy, that's what it must mean. When I tell you, Sam, the variety of things that I process with my clients, it's, you know, from my boss is really hard to deal with and I'm stressed out at work, all the way to, family members being sick and, dealing with grief and things like that and everything in between. Nobody's crazy, right? Nobody, is on the outer edges of society here. These are just living, breathing human beings
Hmm.
who are brave enough to work on themselves. That's what therapy means. Does not mean you're crazy. It means you were courageous enough to lay it out there, to work on yourself, and to go talk about some of the hardest things in life, right? So
Yeah.
this idea, and it's with men, it's major. Like, oh, I'm not one of those cuckoos. Or I'm not one of those crazy people. I don't need that, right? That is not a qualifier here. Okay. And
Yeah.
that word, obviously, just in general, is a very subjective thing and not a clinical word by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But that's so vastly important. And then on that topic, same thing with diagnosis, right? It does not now, you are now not that thing. If you get a diagnosis, the
Mm.
whole point of a diagnosis is to just help inform us on what you're experiencing and how we can help you, right? Mental health is the only thing, from what I can tell, as far as in the medical world, where we define ourselves by diagnosis. Nobody says I am a fever or I am the flu, right?
Yeah.
I have it. I'm experiencing it. But with mental health, I am depressed. I am anxious. I am bipolar. You are not that. You are experiencing it. You experience the symptoms of this thing. Just like when you have a cold, you experience a stuffy nose. You are not that thing, right? So a diagnosis is not some type of like life sentence. It's not, so you're not now in a new destination, right? It is the term that, I don't know, very, very smart people sat down in a book and wrote down as like, these symptoms that you're experiencing are in that category. That's what it means. It's to help inform us on how to help you, right? You are not now a different person. You are not defined by that thing. You are just experiencing it. These symptoms are visiting. Some visit more than others. Some can last a lifetime, depending on what it is, stuff like that. But it's not who you are. It's what you
Yeah.
experience. And I think that's like one of the most important messages I can get across in general.
That's
It's
so
it's not who
powerful.
you are.
Yeah, because it's so many people will. I think almost like a sense of identity. Like if they feel like they don't have an identity with the world around them, they'll cling on to this diagnosis of, oh, I'm depressed. And then one of the things that I like to teach is like you're people will say they're depressed and then they act depressed, therefore only feeding the thought that they're depressed. You can, going back to the emotions, you can choose how you want to behave with them. You can change that in terms of how you behave. Not that it's going to negate the emotion, but you'll be interested. It'll be interesting to see how, when your body starts to change and do different things, that emotion can subside. But oftentimes we get into these, and correct me if I'm wrong, because obviously you're more experienced on this than I am.
No.
But
You got a good feel for this.
when what was my thought? When we're going, we can be having the greatest day, but sometimes as a security blanket, we go back to what these are: anxiety,
Right. Because if
depression.
it's who you are, you got nowhere to go. Right.
Right,
If you
and
say I am depressed, you take you everywhere you go, there's nowhere to go. Right. And so it's kind of this like self-fulfilling prophecy of this is who I am. It's everywhere all the time. Right. And you don't give yourself anywhere to go. People are too you like if you're listening to this and you've experienced this, or anybody in general, you're too valuable of a person. You mean too much. You're too dynamic. There's too many things that make you you to define yourself by that. You mean too much, right? You are so many things. This is one part of your life and something you experience, right? So we're not going to hide from it. You could speak it, right? You could talk about it. I think that's wonderful. Just don't define yourself by it. It's not who you
Yeah.
are. It's too many beautiful things that make you you. You know,
Yeah.
exactly like you said. Once you kind of operate from that place, good things have been going on, and a lot of things can be going on that are wonderful. But if you've defined yourself as depressed, you defined yourself as that's your identity, it's kind of hard to see outside of it.
Yeah, and it's. I think people use it as a crutch, as an excuse too. Like if they make a bad decision, oh, I'm just an anxious person, and can it contribute? I'm sure, yes, but I think it's we
Definitely
can't.
influences.
It goes back to the accountability piece where we have to, if we're going to grow as individuals and give to the world, for the kids, give to our kids, give to the people around us, we have to make the steps to be able to know that in that moment, it's not the definition of who we are. We just screwed up when we're human, and forgive ourselves for that, and learn and continue to move forward instead of clinging on to this. And it even goes back to the anger. Like, people define themselves as an angry person. You're not your emotion. Your emotions are just oh my gosh, drawing a word blank.
You're
A
good.
an accumulation of all of your beliefs and values and everything through all of that. You know what I mean? So, but I don't
Yes.
know if you want anything to add anything
It's
to
what
that,
you're
because I
experiencing.
pretty much, yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, this was awesome. And any last parting words?
Yeah, just to end on that note, like because I do think people get kind of mixed up with the idea of like an excuse and things like that. Talk to people about it and let it be an explanation as to why maybe you do some of the things you do, right? Because I experience depression, sometimes I have difficulty with normal tasks, right? That is an explanation, right? But try not to use it as an excuse. Try not to use it
Hmm.
definitive, right? Because then you're telling yourself you don't have a choice, right? Because
Right.
you experience depression does not now mean you are not capable of. It may explain as to why it's more difficult for you and why sometimes you miss the mark that you're looking for. You live and breathe. You're human. That's okay. But try not to live as it. Try not to do the excuse thing. Do the explanation thing. I think it's a very powerful way to kind of end this all.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. This was very awesome. And I wish we had another hour to just dive into more of this stuff. So,
Yeah.
but thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise, and much appreciated. And that be that. All right, guys. Have a good one. Thanks again, Ryan.